Hello, welcome to Sterling Armory's Oakeshott Typology series. Sorry, we're playing with the music here. Trying to get it down to the right volume. Welcome to the series and welcome to Sterling Armory's YouTube channel. This video is following up on the Oakeshott Typology series, and we are at the end of the pommel video. So we've covered all the blade geometries, we've covered the guard geometries, and this one will finish up the pommel geometries. We do have one more video on the Oakeshott Typology after this, and that will be the sword families that come out of his second book, and that'll be it for the Oakeshott Typology. So if you're new to the channel, Sterling Armory is a bunch of guys who like making blades, and we have this series, but we have a whole podcast called Sword Talk on the same YouTube channel. And you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and we make blades that are used all over the world now, we can say. And we do most of our blades for either HEMA practitioners or martial artists or theater and film, or a lot of reenactors use our blades as well. And the list goes on. So that is us. And we also enjoy talking about everything swords, and including the Oakeshott Typology here. So if you're new to the Oakeshott Typology, and apologies for everyone watching who's been following this, but just I say this every video. The Oakeshott Typology is a very it's a very well documented and researched topology created by Ewart Oakeshott to basically follow the evolution of the medieval sword throughout the medieval times. It's a little bit redundant, but you know what I mean. So, and we use it a lot today just because it's very convenient. It's very easy to name a Oakeshott type, and people will know, if they know the Oakeshott Typology, they'll know what you're talking about. So it's a very easy way to discuss the enormously broad amount of medieval types of weapons, or swords. There's a lot of them. And so unlike Japanese blades where everything's roughly similar, medieval European blades are nowhere near similar to each other. So please go back if you want a more further detailed explanation of the Oakeshott Typology. Please go back to the first video in the series and kind of follow it along. Pommels has been probably the longest. Well, I mean, blades are the longest part of the series, but after blades, pommels are quite long. There's a lot of pommels. So we're getting to the end of them, and they've covered every letter of the alphabet and more. Also, real quick note. So our sources are Oakeshott's books. So mainly for pommels, we're using the first one, which is Sword in the Age of Chivalry. For our next video, next time, we will be using Records of the Medieval Sword, which talks about the sword families as well. So that'll be our next video. But for today, we're just going right off of Swords in the Age of Chivalry. And this is a good comment, and I just had it in my brain, but now I'm blanking who made the comment. But in the prior video, they said, "Hey, instead of saying pommel types, can you use the word form, pommel forms?" And because that's it's very common nowadays when people discussing the Oakeshott Typology, the word type is used for blades. I'm trying to remember what's used for guards. What is guards? Oh, I'm blanking now. Style is used for guards, and then form is used for pommel. But I'm using the words type mainly because that's what's in the actual text. So if anyone watching this video isn't included in those other discussions, they'll know they're typed for pommels because that's what it's written in the book. So I'm going to keep with that for these videos. But yeah, it's much easier to refer to pommels as forms. And that way, if you have a type T pommel and if you have a form T pommel, see, I'm already confused myself. Form T pommel and then a type X blade. Obviously, those two never go together. I'm just as an example. Then it's easy to distinguish one's a pommel, one's a blade. But if you have a type T pommel and a type X blade, you can get those confused, as you saw I just did. So if you see any discussions of the Oakeshott Typology online, odds are instead of using types for pommels, it's going to say form, just so you're aware of that. Okay, but I'm using types because that's what's written in the books. So today is, I think, for HEMA practitioners, these are the most common pommels, because today we're going to be talking about all of the pommels that are prevalent in long swords in later time period. So again, I'll read directly from his words here. So all the prior pommels we've covered so far have been kind of pre-1350. Some of them obviously keep going, like wheel pommels, you can see all the way through, but they're more prevalent earlier on. So what we're covering today, type T all the way to Z, these are pommels that are more prevalent after 1350 all the way up to 1500s. So what he says here is, from the variants of the old disc form, we come to completely new shapes in the 15th century. All these seem to derive from a single basic form, which has been described as a fig, a pear, or a scent stopper form. So that's what we're covering today. And he says scent stopper is the more descriptive term for the shape. And there are 5 variants of the scent stopper pommel, 2 of which are closely related. So let's dive into those. Oh, I'm still getting used to my setup here as well. So type T. So this is the first of the scent stopper pommels, and everything in terms of what I think most modern practitioners consider a scent stopper are all kind of based on this design. So what he says here, he says it's a generally faceted and vertical panels, hence the T name. Though there are plenty of plain examples that are circular. So for those of you who use a lot of fetters, you'll know this pommel is very common on fetters, whether it's faceted or round, but it's basically a pommel that starts pretty narrow, flares up, and then almost makes that scent stopper shape. And there's lots and lots of varieties of this. So one thing though, so we're going to jump to T1 and T2 because there's a lot of subtypes of type T. And then the next version is type V that has subtypes. And I think he kind of confuses the two sometimes in his words. So when we go to T1 and T2, so I guess the quick note, most scent stopper pommels are, at least most scent stopper pommels, as modern makers know and modern users know, are circular cross-section or symmetrical cross-sections. Meaning if you look at this from the top or from the bottom, it looks round or some sort of geometric shape. It's not flattened. It's not ovoid. It's some sort of round shape. Whereas, and every other type T is round shape except for type T1 and type T2. So I'm not sure these, I would think, would be more into the V type pommel, which is more of a flattened fishtail shape, which we'll get to later. But for some reason, he has these included in the scent stopper pommel. So, and fishtails could be scent stoppers as well. There's nothing saying that, but but for some reason, these, because they're flattened instead of being a more consistent cross section, I think they would be more in the V category than the T. But it is what it is, and that's how he categorized it. So, so for T1, again, a variant of the scent stopper. He says it's a truncated wedge, although it may be, in fact, a prototype for all later T-type pommels. Now, I actually think he meant V pommels there, because that's the prototype for all the V pommels. But he also says it's so rare that it seems suitable to classify it just by T. Now, he says it's rare, but I have actually seen that pommel a lot in a lot of, not a lot, but I've seen it more than enough to say that it's rare in medieval examples that I've seen, either at the Met or at the Wallace or at the Royal Armories. I've seen them all over the place. So I'm not sure why he says they're rare. And then the next one, and that's all he says for that, by the way. He doesn't go into detail on that one. So then type T2. So this is type T2 is a very interesting pommel. Again, I would consider this more in the V category, but he calls it a T. And he says the very handsome pommel form seems to be popular in England and Germany from 1360 to 1420. And he goes into a lot more detail about where the specific finds are. What's interesting about T2 is, and I don't know if he says it here, but T2 seems almost always found on type 17 blades. And it's kind of unique to type 17 blades. So I find that interesting. So when we talk about blade families later, that'll come up. And that's in the next video. So that's T1 and T2. And remember these when we go to the V's. Okay, so now back to more what I think would be T-type pommels that go along with the original Type T is now Type T3, T4, and T5. So T3, first one there on the left. So basically it's taking the original Type T pommel and making a squatter variety. He calls it a squatter. This is basically a squished version of it. But it's essentially the same as the original Type T, just squished. So these are often more round than faceted as well. But again, you'll still see faceted versions. And again, these are common on modern hemoblades, fetters, all sorts of things. Type T4. So T4 is the opposite. So instead of squishing that Type T pommel down, now we're elongating it out. So Type T4, again, he's saying just a much more elongated version of Form T. And these are usually faceted, unlike the other one, it's usually rounded. And they tend to, he has a funny comment, they tend to resemble corks more than anything else. So it's true. So Type T4, very extended. There's a lot of Type T4s on the Castellan fine blades, especially the bigger ones. You'll see a bunch of those if you're ever at the Met. They have a great gallery of Castellan fine blades, and I want to say more than half of them have this type of pommel on it, especially the big one. And then T5. So T5 is over on the far right, and this is the more pear-shaped variant of Type T. So it's later used. So this one you start seeing more towards the late 1500s and even into the 1600s. It's on a lot of long swords. If you're ever at the Wallace collection, there's a bunch of later blades that have this type of pommel. But basically just a different version of the sense stopper. Okay. So that is all, I believe. Yes, that is all of the T blades. So again, I said blades. See, I'm mixing them up. T pommels. Okay, now on to the next two. So Type U. Type U is unique. There's no subtypes to Type U. This is actually one of my favorite types. And what's interesting about this type is a lot of folks who see this pommel in an image or see images of swords that have this pommel, the idea of how thin this pommel is not really understood until you see one in 3 dimensions. Now, they're not always that thin. I have seen some thicker versions, but for the most part, they're pretty thin pommels compared to any other pommels. So there's a lot of really neat modern offerings now that have the Type U pommel. There's one from Arms and Armor that's really nice. Their English longsword, I believe it's called. And then the Albion Viceroy. There you go. That used to be one of my favorite Albions, and it still is, but I've come to like other Albions in the last 10-ish years. So, but the Viceroy has a beautiful example of this pommel as well. So from Oakeshott's terminology here, so this could vaguely be called a key shape because it resembles a 19th century watch key, which it does. And he says he thinks it's one of the most handsomest pommels ever made. And there's lots of paintings and sculptures of this form that you can find all through the 15th century. So yeah, that is the Type U pommel. Again, very neat, very interesting style pommel, and very different than any other sense stopper or any other pommel for that matter. So then we jump to Type V pommels. Now, Type V is, I think most people will recognize that as the fishtail. Most people call it, just describe it as a fishtail, but again, Type V is just like Type T, where there are a number of variants. And so if you look at the cross-section, as I was talking about in Type T there, Type T1 and Type T2 look more like V than they do T, in my personal opinion. So if I were to redo this, Type T1 and T2 would actually be under V. But from his words, it's a very distinctive form, described as a fishtail. There are a few examples, and there's a great example in the Wallace collection, and he talks about a couple of the other examples that are around. It's funny that he says there are a few. Again, this is another one that he says there's few examples, but I have seen a lot of historical examples. But basically, it's a fishtail. So V by itself has the cutouts at the top that you see, where it makes it look like more like a fishtail. When we go to the variants of that, so let's jump to those. So we have V1 and V2. Now, if you notice, V1 and T2 are very similar. There's very little difference between those two types of pommels. So basically, if you were to take V1 and see the top is flat and you just round that a little bit, that becomes T2. So I think those should be more commonly in the same family. But V1 is essentially a fishtail. And let me read from him here. So here, the flat faces there are concave, and the edges flow without cutouts in them, and it flares out much more than the traditional fishtail does. So that's what makes V1 a little different. And V1 is one of my favorites. I actually make that one a lot. Actually, both of these, V1 and V2, I make a lot for longswords. And these also exist on some arming swords as well. They're just more prevalent on hand and a half and long swords and two-handed swords. Big two-handed swords have, especially V2, have that a lot. So what is V2? So V2 is basically a more rounded and blunted version of V1. So it's essentially the same shape. He's drawing it more in a heart shape here, and that is seen in some actual pieces. But I have seen ones that are less heart shaped and look more like V1, but just more rounded. So they come in, V2 can be any of those types. So basically, if you take V1 and round it out, you get V2. And that's basically what he says here. So no need to read anymore. And then the last one, so those are the type, again, V pommels, which are all subtypes of the fishtail. And then the last one we have is type Z. So type Z, I think most of you guys would recognize this in the Italian Schiavana blades. Some basket hilts, a lot of basket hilts actually have this type of pommel as well. And he doesn't really say too much about this, other than, what did he say? He just says it's mainly Italian, and you can find it. There's a bunch of them in the arsenal in Venice. And he basically says you find these mostly on the Venetian swords, which are also called the Schiavanas. If I'm saying Schiavana right. I've never known if I've pronounced that right, by the way. Hopefully I am. So yeah, and that is type Z. I've never made one of these type pommels. I haven't done any sort of basket hilt that would have one of these yet. But I do hope to make one of those soon. So that is it for all of the pommels in the Oakeshott Typology. So we've covered, again, A through Z and all the different subtypes. And so hopefully you're enjoying these videos. And again, the next one coming up will be the sword families out of the second book. And that'll be the last video in the Oakeshott series. And I hope you're enjoying the series. And please go and watch our Sword Talk podcast. And we should have another one of those posting in a couple days. So we usually try to post our videos like this on Tuesdays, and then the Sword Talk podcast we try on Thursdays. It doesn't always work out that way, but that's what we try to do. And if you would like to see us in person, we will be at Combat Con coming up towards the middle end of July. So I think it's the 20th. I'm trying to remember now. 23rd through the. I'm totally messing that up, I think. So it is, Combat Con is check-in. So, I'm sorry, totally off. 20th through the 23rd. So we will be there. And should be a very fun show. A lot of great vendors there this year. We have a couple new additions that Combat Con hasn't had before. So it's going to be exciting to see everyone all together. And it sounds like we have a cutting competition finally. So I hope to be participating in that. And that's it for now. So thanks. Let me know in the comments what your favorite type is. And I'll catch you guys next time.